Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Millette with an AP European History presentation. Today's presentation is all about medieval Europe and its well-established political, social, and religious traditions. This presentation is also a prelude to Period 1 in this AP European History course. The purpose in teaching you all about the last century in medieval European history is to help provide context to the emergence of early modern Europe, which is the foundation of this course. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these three learning objectives. One, you should be able to explain some of the political, social, and religious traditions of medieval Europe. Two, you should also be able to explain some of the challenges that medieval European society faced in the 14th century. And three, you should be able to argue medieval Europe's 14th century as a time in which there was a retention of Europe's pre-modern traditions, or the 14th century in medieval European history as a prediction to Europe's modern transition. European history has traditionally been divided into three major eras: the ancient and classical societies of the Greeks and Romans, the medieval period in post-Roman Empire Europe, and the modern period from approximately 1450 or 1500 to the present time. In this presentation, I hope to take you all through the development of medieval European culture and traditions, especially the social, political, and religious traditions, in an effort to establish context for the rise of modern Europe. Granted, as Europe's timeline progressed to the 14th century, vestiges of medieval traditions were ever present, but glimpses at modern Europe can be seen through historiographic eyes. In this presentation, I challenge you all to consider the 14th century as either a century of the continuity of medieval traditions or a century of transition that illuminated the development of modern Europe. The year 476 CE was the year that the Western Roman Empire fell to the Germanic barbarian leader Odovaker. Odovaker forced the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, to abdicate his throne. In the wake of the fallen Western Roman Empire, Europe would embark on a new political existence, one that took Europe through political instability, division, decentralization, and vulnerability. Never again would the peoples of Europe exist in the permanence of unity and imperialism that the Roman Empire afforded during the height of its existence. Instead, the former cities, roads, and other architectural and engineering feats accomplished by the Romans would gradually succumb to Germanic control. Germanic peoples settled throughout Europe and developed small regional states and kingdoms. Some of these Germanic states were temporary, as they experienced invasion and military defeat by foreign groups. For example, the Visigoths were the Germanic peoples who initially settled in modern-day Spain, Portugal, and Italy. However, they were ultimately defeated by Islamic Umayyad forces in the 8th century CE. In addition, the Vandals were the Germanic peoples who initially settled in modern-day North Africa, as well as the Mediterranean islands of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. Byzantine forces under Justinian I invaded locations in the Mediterranean and ultimately defeated the Vandals during the 6th century CE. Other Germanic peoples succeeded in building longer-lasting states in the lands of the former Western Roman Empire. Some examples included the Anglo-Saxons in modern-day England, the Lombards in modern-day Italy, and the Burgundians in modern-day France. However, the Franks were by far the most successful state builders of all of the Germanic peoples, as they built the foundations for the modern nation-states of France and Germany. The Franks, under the leadership of Charles Martel, gave rise to the Carolingian Empire of modern-day France and Germany. Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, became the most powerful Carolingian leader, and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800 CE. When the Carolingian Empire divided during the middle of the 9th century CE, its eastern portion gave rise to a German reign over the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire became a loosely integrated political entity of German states that existed up until 1806 CE. Many other Germanic states and kingdoms stabilized and gave rise to the beginnings of the modern European states of Spain, unified in 1492, Portugal unified in 1139, England unified in 927, France unified in 987, Italy unified in 1861, and Germany unified in 1871. Granted, many of these places remained politically fragmented long after 1450, as in the cases of Spain, Italy, and Germany. These multiple and independent European states formed out of the necessity of protecting local territories and peoples from invading groups, such as the Muslims, or the Magyars, and the Vikings. Granted, many of these invading groups succeeded in their invasions and ultimately built their own states inside of Europe. With the absence of a single centralized, unified, and imperialistic state like the Roman Empire, military protection became the responsibility of local political, military, and economic elites. In effect, this led to the political and social foundations of what became known as European feudalism. Feudalism became the decentralized political and social system of Europe that was characterized by national monarchs entrusting their lands to the wealthy landowning nobility. The nobility were expected to fortify and militarily protect the monarch's lands and peoples. The nobility were also responsible for the economic productivity of the land and made feudal contracts with serfs, or semi-free agricultural laborers who were bound to the noble's land and were expected to produce and give their surplus as a rent to the nobles. This feudal system provided political and social stability in Europe until the system started to become obsolete in the early modern period after 1450. The late Middle Ages in Europe was a dichotomous time period in that it retained the feudalistic hierarchical social order as had been established in the early Middle Ages. Yet it also challenged that feudalistic social order with a greater awakening of national consciousness within Europe. Definitively, the national monarchs of nations such as England and France relied on strong alliances between themselves and their most prominent nobles. In France, for example, monarchical power barely reached beyond the vicinity of Paris by the early 14th century, so it was imperative that the French monarchy maintained good relations and military alliances with their nobles in distant French lands, such as Normandy, Flanders, and Burgundy. However, by the time of the 14th century, French monarchs had made some headway in terms of being able to raise taxes, which increased their national treasuries and financed their own militaries. For example, by the time of the reign of French King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and the early reign of French King Philip VI in the early 14th century, the establishment of the French Estates General had enabled these monarchs to raise taxes to pursue their own nationalistic military goals. In England, greater centralization of the national monarch's political and military power increased after the Norman conquest in 1066 with the rise of King William I, otherwise known as William the Conqueror. Additionally, the fact that a Norman basically someone of Viking heritage living in the region of Normandy in northern France, had conquered England. Lands in continental France were subject to the Norman kings of England. During the time of Norman rule in England, successful kings utilized great councils from the ranks of the English clergy and the nobility. Unsuccessful English kings, such as John III, during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, clashed with members of the Great Council, which led to the development of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta ultimately secured English nobles their property rights and deemed monarchical taxes on the nobility null and void without noble consent. However, it was these great councils that evolved into the English Parliament in the 13th century, and English monarchs that retained good relations with the Parliament increased their national treasuries with increased taxation. As national monarchs of France and England increased their national treasuries through increased taxation, they were able to build standing professional armies. Ultimately, this ability to raise taxes and raise standing armies meant that national monarchs were more powerful than ever before in medieval Europe. By the 14th century, the kings of France and England were powerful enough to wage war against each other in pursuit of their respective nations' expansion and prosperity. This came to a head in 1337 with the outbreak of the Hundred Years' War. With the death of French King Charles IV, a dispute between the French and the English as to who was the rightful heir to the French throne manifested itself into this elongated, multi-generational, nationally charged conflict. English King Edward III, who would reign over England for 50 years during the 14th century, was the grandson of the French King Philip IV, or Philip the Fair. Ever the aggressor, Edward III believed he was the rightful heir to the French throne, and basically viewed the entirety of France as a vassalage of England. This is what spawned the English invasion of France in 1337, sparking the outbreak of the Hundred Years' War. Edward III's successful campaigns at Crécy in 1346 and Calais in 1347 in northern France secured numerous French territories under England's control in the first 10 years of the war. On this slide, you see a manuscript depicting a battle scene from the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Here, the French army, on the left side of the battle, along with Italian mercenaries, are utilizing French crossbows. On the right side of the battle scene is the English army, which is using the English longbow. Notice the mortal wounds taken by the French soldiers while they're busy trying to unjam and reload their crossbows. Also notice the advancing English soldiers and the void of mortal wounds in the English soldiers. With advanced weaponry such as the English longbow, the French armor that protected French knights was no longer the impenetrable force it once was. Consider the changing of weapons technologies in the 14th century and its diminishing of the tactics and strategies of medieval warfare. On this slide, you can see a manuscript depicting an English siege of a French citadel during the Hundred Years' War. Not only are the crossbows and longbows present in this manuscript, but so too are English fire lances and siege cannons. Consider the transition in weapons technologies during the 14th century as a reason for the decline of not only the nobility and their knighthood and military strength, but also their inability to retain their citadels and their castles, cornerstones of their ability to provide protection to local populations throughout medieval Europe. Edward III's son, Edward, the Black Prince, served England victoriously and was known for his courage, bravery, chivalry, and victory by his English subjects. But to the French, the Black Prince was an invader, a murderer, and the scourge of French townspeople. Here you can see his invasion route through the southern region of France. A decade after the English victory at Crécy in northern France, the English, under the command of the Black Prince, would score a second decisive victory against the French at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. This would secure territories in the western portion of France. How brutal was the Black Prince against French subjects? This primary source of the Siege of La Motte in southern France describes the brutality of the event. Having mined the town walls, the miners set fire into their mine, and so the next morning, as the prince had ordained, there fell down a great piece of the wall and filled the moats, whereof the Englishmen were glad and were ready, armed in the field, to enter the town. The footmen might well enter at their ease, and so they did, and ran to the gate, and beat down the fortification and barriers, for there was no defence against them. It was done so suddenly that they of the town were not aware thereof. Then Edward the Black Prince, and all the others, with their companies, entered into the city, and all other footmen ready apparelled to do evil, and to pill and rob the city, and to slay men, women, and children, for so it was commanded them to do. It was a great pity to see the men, women, and children that kneeled down on their knees before the prince for mercy. But he was so inflamed with the ire that he took no heed of them, so that none was heard, but all put to death as they were met, and such as were nothing culpable. There was no pity taken of the poor people, who wrought never no manner of treason, yet they bought it dearer than the great personages, such as had done the evil and trespass. There was not so hard a heart within the city of Limoges, and if he had any remembrance of God, but that wept piteously for the great mischief that they saw before their eyes, for more than 3,000 men, women, and children were slain that day. Brutal English occupation under the Black Prince sent France into numerous social upheavals, such as the French Jockey, that were difficult to suppress in the wake of such military defeat and weakness. Granted, England would also deal with peasant uprisings at this time, since the fog of war and disease tended to incite great rebellious activities. In this primary source, you can see the cracks of the French feudal system and its failure to keep social order in times of great despair and challenges. There were very strange and terrible happenings in several parts of the kingdom of France. They began when some of the men from the country towns came together in the Beauvais region. They had no leaders, and at first they numbered scarcely 100. One of them got up and said that the nobility of France, knights and squires, were disgracing and betraying the realm, and that it would be a good thing if they were all destroyed. At this they all shouted, "He's right, he's right. Shame on any man who saves the gentry from being wiped out." They banded together and went off, without further deliberation, and unarmed except for pikes and knives, to the house of a knight who lived near by. They broke in and killed the knight, with his lady and his children, big and small, and set fire to the house. Next they went to another castle, and did much worse, for having seized the knight and bound him securely to a post, several of them violated his wife and daughter before his eyes. Then they killed the wife, who was pregnant, and the daughter and all the other children, and finally put the knight to death with great cruelty, and burned and razed the castle. And those evil men, who had come together without leaders or arms, pillaged and burned everything, and violated and killed all the ladies and girls without mercy, like mad dogs. Their barbarous acts were worse than anything that ever took place between Christians and Saracens. Perhaps the cracks in the French feudal system and upheavals like the Jockey were warning signs to the end of medieval practices like feudalism, the decline of the power and prestige of the nobility, and all of this at the hands of increasingly powerful national monarchs. However, England's hold on French territory continued into the early 15th century, but no English victory did more to bury the French than the English victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1450 in northern France. Led by English King Henry V, the victory at Agincourt was, in part, credited to the large number of English longbowmen. After Agincourt, England's grip on northern and western France increased, and Henry V's heir, Henry VI, would become the recognized king of both England and France in 1422. After 1429, the momentum of the war began to change in favor of France. In the French city of Orleans, to the southwest of Paris, which had been long held by the English due to earlier victories, initial French forces had decided to make an attempt at retaking the city. In essence, the French began the Siege of Orleans in 1428. In 1429, a young French peasant girl named Joan of Arc arrived in Orleans, and with her army in tow, the French numbers increased to nearly 10,000 soldiers and armed peasants. Prior to her command, Joan had met with Charles VII, who was the recognized French king by French loyalists, although technically English King Henry VI legally reigned as Henry II over France per the Treaty of Troyes. In that meeting, Joan inspired Charles to support her campaign to Orleans, and in his desperation, he threw his complete support and the fate of the French nation on the back of a 15-year-old French peasant girl. Joan inspired a boost in French morale and national identity with her success at Orleans. And when the French siege was lifted, the English began the process of removing their troops from the northern portion of France. In the midst of the continued warfare between the French and the English, Joan of Arc was captured and brought to English inquisitors in English-held Normandy, where she would be interrogated and ultimately convicted of heresy and then executed by being burned at the stake in 1431. Though her fate had fallen into the hands of the English and their continental allies, the French persisted with their campaigns against the English, and ultimately by 1453, the English had given up their holds on French lands, with the exception of Calais, and retreated back to England. Although the English would fall into a 30-year civil war, known as the War of the Roses, in the late 15th century, the eventual rise of the Tudor dynasty would give way to an immensely powerful English monarchy. Likewise, future Valois kings in France experienced far greater political and military prowess than their Capetian predecessors. Even beyond the Valois dynasty, eventually, the Bourbon dynasty in France would come to power in the 16th century, increasing monarchical power to an unprecedented level. Consider the toll that was taken on the system of feudalism and its ability to keep order. With that, consider how that would have negatively impacted and weakened the authority of the nobility and their military strength. If any aspect of Roman culture endured in medieval Europe, it was most definitely its religious aspect. That religious contribution was Roman Catholicism, an institutionalized and widely accepted Christian tradition that was spearheaded by the political elites of the late Roman Empire. The strength, popularity, and protection the Roman Catholic Church gave the faith of Christianity did not encompass the entire story of the Christian beginnings. For many Roman political elites of the 1st century CE, Christianity was a foreign faith that disrespected Roman traditions, gods, and the reign of Rome's Caesars. Though Christian origin was in Southwest Asia, its early appeal to marginalized peoples in Southern European societies near the Mediterranean enabled a popular existence of Christianity in spite of initial persecution from Roman political elites. Although many Greeks and Romans had long practiced polytheism, many Greek and Roman poorer classes initially gravitated to the teachings of Jesus and his monotheistic faith. It would not be until the 4th century CE when Roman Christians would be protected by a decree made by Roman Emperor Constantine I in his Edict of Milan, which allowed for Roman tolerance of Christianity. By the end of the 4th century CE, Christianity would be made the official religion of the Roman Empire by decree made by Roman Emperor Theodosius. It is during this time when Christianity would take on a much more Romanesque brand, and the Roman Catholic Church would become the prominent institution that promoted that brand of Christianity. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity would still thrive in medieval Europe. Germanic leaders and peoples began to abandon their pagan ways and adopted Christianity. The first of the Germanic leaders to make a conversion to Christianity was the Frankish king Clovis. In 496 CE, just 20 years after the last Western Roman emperor abdicated his throne to a Germanic barbarian, Frankish king Clovis converted from Frankish paganism to Roman Catholicism. Inevitably, a game of follow the leader would ensue, as many Frankish peoples and other Germanic societies began to adopt Roman Catholicism. Clovis's conversion to Roman Catholicism created a special, symbiotic relationship between him and the Pope from Rome. In essence, the most prominent religious figure in Europe, the Pope, would share an important element with the European monarchs that converted to and protected Roman Catholicism. Throughout the medieval period, the position of the Pope strengthened in prestige, political authority, and reach of the Roman Catholic Church. The papacy of 6th century Pope Gregory I asserted papal supremacy over all of Christendom. This meant that all Christians were under the supreme spiritual authority of the Pope, no matter their nationality or socioeconomic or political status. Kings and paupers, men and women, elderly and infants, and everyone in between were subjected to the Pope's authority. Medieval popes wielded immense authority over individuals and heretical movements, such as the power to excommunicate individuals from the Catholic Church. Excommunication resulted in an individual losing their Catholic identity, losing the services provided by their local parish, and jeopardizing their salvation. Popes even had the power of interdict, which meant that the Pope could place a monarch and his entire kingdom into excommunication. Oftentimes, the relationships between popes and European monarchs became tested when political and military issues emerged. Roman Catholic monasteries and convents became the residences of devout monks and nuns to the service of the church. They were instrumental in providing manual labor, orphanages, hospitals, scriptoriums, and academics for its members and its hierarchy. Roman Catholic missionaries were aggressive in the medieval period, and many peoples assimilated into Christian European society. Christianity did not remain unitary. As in the case of many other world religions, Christianity succumbed to division in spite of the Roman Catholic Church's leadership. To Europe's east was the mighty Byzantine Empire, a wealthy and prominent empire that embraced Christian traditions. However, at its capital of Constantinople resided an emperor who entered a power struggle with the Pope from Rome. After a few centuries of religious and political turmoil, the Pope from Rome and the Byzantine Emperor's patriarch from Constantinople mutually excommunicated each other in 1054 CE. This schism, or religious division, divided Christendom into two opposing Western and Eastern halves. To the west, the Roman Catholic Church would reign supreme, but to the east, the Byzantine, or Eastern Orthodox Church, would reign supreme, and this division has never been bridged since that time. As well, Christianity was not the only religion present in Europe. Judaism had retained its presence in different parts of Europe. Although in many cases Jewish communities were left alone to their own religious practices and traditions, in times of great challenges, Christians would practice extreme forms of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the prejudicial and discriminatory actions that people take against the Jews simply because of their differing religious and ethnic identities. Jewish communities suffered immense anti-Semitism during the Crusades and the Black Death, as Christian militaries and Christian radicals targeted them during these times of great challenges to European society. The excerpt on this slide is a source from 1349 about the mass killings of a Jewish community in Strasbourg in eastern France during the outbreak of the Black Death. In the year 1349, there occurred the greatest epidemic that ever happened. Death went from one end of the earth to the other, on that side and this side of the sea, and it was greater among the Muslims than among the Christians. In some lands, everyone died, so that no one was left. Ships were also found on the sea laden with wares. The crew had all died, and no one guided the ship. The Bishop of Marseille, of France, and priests and monks, and more than half of all the people there died with them. In other kingdoms and cities, so many people perished that it would be horrible to describe. The Pope at Avignon stopped all sessions of court, locked himself in a room, allowed no one to approach him, and had a fire burning before him all the time. And from what this epidemic came, all wise teachers and physicians could only say that it was God's will. And as the plague was now here, so was it in other places, and lasted more than a whole year. This epidemic also came to Strasbourg, France, in the summer of the above-mentioned year, and it is estimated that about 16,000 people died. In the matter of this plague, the Jews throughout the world were reviled and accused in all lands of having caused it through the poison which they said to have put into the water and the wells. That is what they were accused of, and for this reason the Jews were burnt all the way from the Mediterranean into Germany, but not in Avignon, for the Pope protected them there. In addition to Judaism, Islam was another religion that gained popularity in small pockets of Europe. Initially, Islam posed a challenge. It posed itself as a challenge to Christian Europe through early invasions by the Umayyad Caliphate. Arab Muslims conquered Spain and established the Islamic State of Al-Andalus, and attempted to push into France during the 8th century. Arab Muslims also developed states in Sicily and Italy. It was incumbent on European Christian political and military leaders, such as Charles Martel and Charlemagne, to defend their Christian populations and territories from Islamic invasion. Christian and Muslim tensions reached their heights during the times of the Crusades to Jerusalem and the Reconquista in Spain in the late medieval period. The Roman Catholic Church had a tradition of dominance over the Christians of Europe. But by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, political leaders in Europe began to challenge the power of the papacy. The papacy saw its primacy as justification for taking tax money and resources out of European nations. French King Philip IV, Philip the Fair, took issue with this papal taxation. And why shouldn't he? Why should a national monarch sit idle and watch money and resource leave his country to serve the papacy in Rome? Philip's resistance spawned Pope Boniface VIII's issuance of a papal bull known as Unum Sanctum, which essentially reinforced papal primacy and dominance over national monarchs. The papal bull read, "We are told by the word of the gospel that in this, his fold, there are two swords, a spiritual, namely, and a temporal. Both swords, the spiritual and the material, therefore, are in the power of the church, the one, indeed, to be wielded for the church, the other by the church. The one by the hand of the priest, the other by the hand of kings and knights, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. One sword, moreover, ought to be under the other, and the temporal authority to be subjected to the spiritual. Indeed, we declare, say, pronounce, and define that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. In response, Philip the Fourth raised an army that marched on Rome in 1303 and kidnapped the Pope and physically beat and tortured him for 3 days. This beating ultimately led to Pope Boniface's death and drastically shifted the balance of power between national monarchs and popes within Europe. Six years later, the papacy would officially relocate to the city of Avignon in France. The Avignon papacy would lead the Catholic Church until 1376, although many Europeans, especially Italians, refused to recognize the Avignon papacy. The existence of this French papacy challenged the medieval tradition of a powerful and dominant Roman papacy and shed light on a strengthening national monarchy, especially the French monarchy. The end of the Avignon papacy did not occur with a great reunification of all Roman Catholics. Rather, in the year 1377, there would be the restored Roman papacy and its Italian pope, Urban VI, who was supported by his fellow Italians, and a rival French pope, known as the anti-pope, Clement VII, who was supported by his fellow French. Clearly, the Roman Catholic Church was no longer the great religious and cultural unifier it had been in Western Europe for the past near millennia. If the existence of two popes was not complex enough, nor divisive enough, imagine in the year 1409 the existence of three popes would clearly demonstrate the decline of the unifying force of the Roman Catholic Church and the power of the papacy. In the Roman papacy, Pope Gregory XII had been elected, but in Avignon, anti-pope Benedict XIII had been promoted. And in order to bridge the division between the Italian and French Catholics, Pope Alexander V was named at a special council in Pisa, Italy. Three popes in 1 year definitely did not spell out the unity of the Catholic Church, and it shed light on the potential for laymen, political leaders, and religious clerics to critique, question, and challenge the Catholic Church's authority, a characteristic of modern European culture. Amidst the decline of feudalism, the rise of national monarchical power, and the decline of the Roman Catholic Church, nothing seemed to expedite these transitions more than the outbreak of the Bubonic Plague in the middle of the 14th century. An Afro-Eurasian experience, the Bubonic Plague was a characteristic of the Pax Mongolica, a time of Mongolian peace over the Asian lands controlled by the Mongolian Khans. The Pax Mongolica had been characterized by positive points of economic, technological, and cultural integration, which included great economic benefit to the towns and the peoples of Europe, especially those residing near the Black and Mediterranean seas. In fact, throughout the 13th and early 14th centuries, medieval Europe experienced increased economic production, commercial activity, and population growth. The urban revolution of the 13th and early 14th centuries seemed to be reminiscent of the socio-economic prosperity of the Roman period. However, the Pax Mongolica ended with a great biological exchange of deadly pathogens that claimed the lives of more than a third of the Afro-Eurasian populations. That lethal biological exchange was known as the Black Death. Between 1348 and 1351, the Black Death, a term used to describe the bubonic plague, ravaged the East Asian, Central Asian, Southwest Asian, North African, and European towns and cities. Beginning in the east and heading west, the plague entered the urban populations of Afro-Eurasia. Those towns and cities were interconnected through the land routes, like the Silk Road, that were predominantly protected by the Mongols. Equipped to manage the diffusion of goods and culture, the Mongols failed to manage the spread of plague. In the unsanitary conditions of late medieval cities, and the flea-infested labor animals that accompanied merchants into rat-infested towns, the carriers of plague sped through Afro-Eurasia with the speed that was afforded by Mongolian protection. With such high mortality and drastic social and economic consequences, many devout Roman Catholics in Europe gravitated one of two directions. In one direction, some Roman Catholics embraced their religion and worked to regain the favor of a forgiving Christian God. In another direction, some Roman Catholics pulled away from their religious convictions, convinced that God had punished them, and in some ways abandoned them. This loss of faith may have been the catalyst for Europe's early modern developments in the fields of science, medicine, and in the early modern worldviews of humanists, critics, and skeptics. So, what do you think? To what extent was the 14th century a continuation of medieval traditions, or a transition toward a modernizing Europe?